it's a puzzle for economists. You know, we see these disasters happen around the world, the communities completely devastated and destroyed, that at the time that the disaster happens, it's sort of unclear how a community could even bounce back from something like that. How is it that it could, could recover from such devastation? But yet we see that many communities, maybe even most communities, do in fact recover. And so this is something of a puzzle for, at least for economists. I think it's a puzzle generally. And so today I'm going to talk about my most recent book on this topic. It's called, the title of the book is Community Revival in the Wake of Disaster: Lessons in Local Entrepreneurship. It's a book that's co-written with my colleagues Stephanie Haffley-Balch and Laura Grube. And that book really tries to get at, in particular, the role of entrepreneurship in post-disaster recovery. And so I spent August 29th, 2005, glued to my television set, watching New Orleans basically get beaten up by Hurricane Katrina. And then the days that follow, sort of watching what seemed to be even a greater disaster unfold. Jeremy mentioned that I'm from the Bahamas, so it's a place that gets hurricanes all the time. So I'm an experienced hurricane watcher. I started watching hurricanes when I was a young child. I remember being 4 years old, peering out of, sort of the gap in the shutters, watching sort of trees being blown back and forth and debris being thrown up against, sort of cars and buildings. So I'm an experienced hurricane watcher. I've been watching hurricanes long before I got involved in the project that took us to try to look at how New Orleans would bounce back. But despite being an experienced hurricane watcher, it's fair to say that I never saw anything like I saw those days watching that TV screen. So first a city, that seemed to be almost completely underwater, more than a dozen feet in some areas. That people stranded on rooftops. Their streets were rivers, waiting to be rescued. The signs painted on their ceilings like, "Please help." That people wading through water that was waist high, and sometimes chest high, carrying like a garbage bag. That's sort of all they managed to save from their homes, or even more horrific, sometimes carrying a small child. And then eventually, the scenes from the Superdome and the Convention Center, scenes that quite frankly didn't make sense as scenes from the United States. They seemed like scenes that made more sense from some other country. That masses of people that had so obviously been sort of devastated by the hurricane, now sort of abandoned, it seemed to be, by the emergency relief services, homes, and then we eventually got sort of looks into the neighborhood. Sort of, again, still on TV before I had an opportunity to visit there, and you see sort of homes missing roofs or missing walls, or sometimes just foundations where homes used to be, the homes completely washed away. And the question then was, can this community recover? And if it could recover, then how could it recover? And so there's reasons actually to doubt that it could recover. The one reason is that disaster recovery is a massive collective action problem. So this is a sort of term of art in economics. It means a circumstance where if we could cooperate, we would all be better off. If we find ways to work together, we would all be better off. But it's in no one's individual interest to cooperate, to participate in the collective action, unless and until we were sure that everybody else was going to do it. There's reasons why a disaster is something like a collective action problem. One reason is that the cost of rebuilding after a disaster are extremely high. There's sort of rebuilding a home that was completely destroyed, requires money, requires time. There's the psychic toll of sort of picking through damaged and destroyed stuff. There's the opportunity cost of not rebuilding your life over somewhere else. But while the costs are extremely high, maybe even predictable, the benefits of returning and rebuilding are at best uncertain. That there's so many questions that you just want to have answers to before committing to return that you just can't get answers to, you don't have answers to. And so, what would my community be like in 5 years, 10 years after the storm is a question that you'd want to know before deciding to rebuild your home. what business opportunities will exist. If I own a business, will I be able to find employees of the caliber that I had before the storm? Will I be able to find customers that are willing to frequent my enterprise in the way that they were before the storm? What public services would be available? If I was someone who had a child in school, is the school that my child went to, is that going to be open? If it reopens, is it going to be the same kind of quality school that it was before the storm? That's again something that you'd want to know before committing to return. Similarly, what will the disrupted social networks that I belong to, will they be restored? Will they come back? If I belong to a church that I value and that I found a meaningful experience to attend, is that church going to actually open up after, in a year or 2 or 10 after after we've recovered from the disaster, or isn't it? Will my neighbors come back? Is the neighborhood that I live in going to be the same kind of neighborhood that I lived in before the storm? There's just so many questions that you want to have answers to, that you can't have answers to. And then the worse the disaster, the harder it turns out it is to find answers to these kinds of questions. These questions become even more difficult to answer in that kind of circumstance. The greater uncertainty, the greater the disaster. And in that kind of circumstance, that kind of collective action problem, the rational move for me, for anyone who's suffering that disaster, is to basically wait and see, right? To let everybody else make the decision to come back and return and rebuild first, and then make the decision to return and rebuild. But if that's the rational move for anybody, it turns out that's the rational move for anybody, for everybody. And so then you have this collective action problem, where it seems like recovery just isn't a rational thing to occur, because for everybody the rational move is to wait and see. And the collective action problem after Hurricane Katrina seemed particularly pronounced, because this was so much damage, so many people displaced. But yet the city is, and in many respects has recovered. And the question is, how did it do it? And the answer we offer in the book is the entrepreneur. And when by entrepreneur, we don't just mean commercial entrepreneurs, we mean also political and social entrepreneurs, but the entrepreneur is the hero of our story. It turns out, to confess, I'm a big fan of the entrepreneur. That even in normal times, in mundane times, right? They risk their livelihoods, they neglect their families, work ridiculous hours to give us the kind of products that we want, the kind of goods we want, the kind of societies and policies that we want. So think of somebody like Steve Jobs. He's dying of cancer, and he's working feverishly to get us the next generation of the iPad and the iPhone. Or think of somebody, again, we have a broad definition that we use in the book. Think of somebody like Martin Luther King, right? Willing to give his life for something like civil rights. So in normal times, entrepreneurs bring about technological transformation and social transformation and political transformation. And after the disaster, we argue in the book that they do these 3 roles. They provide needed goods and services, they restore disrupted social networks, and they signal the community rebound is likely and in fact already underway. So let me pause here and give you a roadmap of where I'm going to go for the rest of the talk, so you have a sense of what I'm going to cover and to hopefully make it easier for you to follow. Then I'll begin by talking about the challenge and status of post-Katrina recovery. In essence, give you a report card on how recovery has gone and is going. I'm going to highlight some of the specific challenges related to Hurricane Katrina, a hurricane that hit New Orleans on August 29, 2005, flooding as much as 12 feet in some areas, lasting days and weeks in some areas, in a city that's 49% below sea level, the disaster that's described as the largest natural disaster in U.S. history. And after giving you something to report on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader project of which this work is a part and give you a sense of what the empirical strategy is that we used, speak about the time we spent in the field and the way we gathered the information we have. And then I'm going to tell you stories about 3 entrepreneurs, one performing each of the 3 functions. And then there's some time at the end, I'll sort of make some sort of brief comments about public policy, implications of this, and then hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions. So let me tell you a little bit about Katrina and give you a report card on post-Katrina recovery. Hurricane Katrina is a disaster that resulted in over 1,800 deaths. Some major, that over $100 billion of property damage. Again, described as the largest natural disaster and certainly the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history. That over 55% of the homes in Orleans Parish in New Orleans had major to severe damage or were completely destroyed. By major damage, I mean damage greater than $15,000 worth of damage. That over hundreds of thousands were left homeless and displaced by the disaster. Tens of thousands of businesses were affected. Hundreds of thousands of job losses. And this is, you know, in the scope of like disasters around the world, this is a relatively small disaster in some senses, right? So compare it to say something like Haiti, the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, that's 160,000 deaths. That's 1.5 million people left homeless. But as you can see from the pictures, the damage was significant. Again, a city almost completely underwater. Massive failures of the official emergency relief services. Homes destroyed or significantly damaged. The start of 2006, this was a typical scene in New Orleans. And this. And this. And so not surprisingly, post-Katrina recovery has been slow. And in some places, it's still incomplete. That in 2005, prior to the disaster, there were 203,000 active households in Orleans Parish. By an active household, it doesn't sort of count how many people are living in the household. It just means that there's a home on the property and that the home is receiving mail. So it's an active household, and you know, as indicated by the U.S. Postal Service. And so when we speak to sort of active households after the disaster, it doesn't mean that the house that was on the property before was completely rebuilt. It could be no house at all and just a trailer. It could be a house that's partially rebuilt. It doesn't mean that the number of people that lived in the house before actually returned. It just means that there's one person living in the house. And so it sort of overstates the optimistic view of recovery. And even on these optimistic numbers, you know, almost, you know, close to a year after Katrina, it's only 50% of the active households that existed before or exist. The 3 years after Katrina, that number is 72% of the houses that existed prior to Katrina. More than half of the 72 neighborhoods are 90% recovered by 2015. That while recovery has been slow and incomplete, it's also been uneven. So some communities are at pre-Katrina levels, actually greater than pre-Katrina levels. Some communities are still hovering around 70%. Some communities, like the communities right next to where the levees were breached, are not, you know, sort of not neighbors at all. You drive through the streets and you just see foundations and now grass probably growing over those foundations for streets and streets, for blocks and blocks. And so our question in the research, in the broader project was, you know, why did people return? Why would you come back to something so devastating? Why wouldn't you just start your life over someplace else? And how do people overcome the problem that is post-disaster recovery, this collective action problem that I laid out in the beginning? And our approach, because we cared about the whys and hows that people were of disaster recovery, was an interview-based qualitative approach. So we talked to a lot of people on the ground, spent a lot of time in New Orleans. We talked to over 300 plus people from New Orleans. That those interviews were, you know, close to an hour each. That we spent a lot of time talking to people about what their experiences were like prior to the disaster, what their experiences were like during the disaster, and then why and how they came back after the disaster. But we also wanted to get a sense of why people hadn't returned. And so we talked to people who had been displaced by the disaster and that lived in Houston, and asked them some of the same questions. What is it that's blocking you from recovering? And we found several answers. That my colleague Emily Chamley Wright and I, in her own work and in our work together, to the question of why, it seemed like why was driven, the reason people wanted to come back so badly to New Orleans was that it was just a strong sense of place. New Orleans, it was a ridiculous place attachment. If you've been to New Orleans, you will hear, and we heard constantly in our interviews, There's just no place like New Orleans. New Orleans is a special place. And so people would tell the stories of their lives and the places that they've been displaced to, some, Houston and Baton Rouge and Atlanta and other places in Utah. And they talk about their lives there and they just say, look, I just miss New Orleans. There was just something just so different about New Orleans than these places where I just had to come back. They couldn't imagine building their lives somewhere else. And so to the answer to the why question, that seemed to be the driving theme, that there was just something about New Orleans that was special. To the how question, there are a couple answers that seem to jump out. There's no one answer that sort of captures it all. That some of our work emphasizes the role of social capital as the reason, as a sort of, as a useful tool in helping people to come back. And so it's social capital in two forms, both social capital in the form of social networks, and so the sort of relationships that people had, people were able to rely on those relationships for mutual aid and for information about places to stay, sources of funds, ways to get goods and services, but also social capital in the form of collective narratives, the sort of stories that people told themselves about themselves. And so we talked to people in St. Bernard Parish who describe themselves, when you sort of ask them what does it mean to be somebody from St. Bernard Parish, they would say, look, we're a hardworking, self-reliant people. That kind of ethos of being hardworking and self-reliant turned out to be a really useful motivation for recovery and useful driver. And then, as I said in the book, we talk about these three themes. We argue that entrepreneurs facilitate community revival after disaster by providing these needed goods and services. It's a pedestrian point, right? But it's an important point. Recall, more than half the homes and then the things in those homes were damaged or destroyed. The recovery involved replacing those damaged or destroyed things and rebuilding those damaged homes. Replacing the buildings and the furniture and the clothing. And so through their businesses and their charities and their entrepreneurs work to provide the needed goods and services that people required. The entrepreneurs also help to restore and replace disrupted social networks. Recall again that after Katrina, members of the same community, of the same family in some instances, were displaced, were evacuated and exiled in some instances to radically different places. That more than half the residents of New Orleans did not, remove that, and they're having to leave New Orleans immediately following Katrina, in many cases for months, in some cases for years. But also recall that social capital, I just mentioned in the previous slide, one of the things that we found that was really important was social networks and being able to rely on and leverage those social networks. And so if recovery was to happen, those networks had to be reconnected, they had to be restored. And one of the things that entrepreneurs did was restore those networks. And finally, entrepreneurs played an important role in signaling the community rebound is likely to occur and is in fact already underway. That because disaster recovery is a collective action problem, the cost of being a first mover is potentially prohibitive. Remember that in a collective action problem, the rational move for everybody is to wait and see, let others engage in the recovery first and to wait on the sidelines. Well, entrepreneurs acted as first movers, but then also encourage people by their example and their efforts to come back. So let me tell you a few stories. And I'll begin by telling you the story of Casey Kasem. So Casey Kasem is the owner of, or was at the time the owner of Discount Zone in the 9th Ward. The 9th Ward is a particular, in particular, the lower 9th Ward around where the Discount Zone, which is now called Brothers Mart, is located, is an overwhelmingly African-American community. It's also one of the poorest communities in New Orleans, so it had many of the social ills that disadvantaged communities can and do have. It also has, though, high incidences of home ownership, and the people there expressed a really strong sense of place attachment. The interview after interview described the community as a close-knit community that was vibrant and thriving. The Ninth Ward is also that place that suffered, if you were watching your TV screens around the time that Katrina hit, the Ninth Ward is also the place that you were most likely to see. It's where Spike Lee's, it's where the levees broke. The Ninth Ward suffered the most severe damage. It's the site of multiple levee breaches, resulting in 20-foot storm surges. The flooding of up to 12 feet throughout the neighborhood. 3,000 of the 4,700 homes were beyond repair. And residents were also kept out for multiple months after the storm. So even the things that weren't established and weren't damaged and destroyed during the storm ended up festering and rotting and ultimately being destroyed. So in 2003, Casey had invested $2 million in this facility, and again, this poor neighborhood in New Orleans. And the facility was meant to be a one-stop shop for just about everything. So it sold gasoline, it was a convenience store, it was a laundromat, it was a takeout restaurant, and on the second floor it had apartments. Casey, it turns out, remember I said that the entrepreneurs are the heroes of the story? Well, it turns out Casey was a hero in sort of the classic sense of the term, too. Before the storm, he decided to wait out the storm in his store. He didn't live in the Ninth Ward, but he decided that he'd wait out the storm in his store. He sent his kids to Texas with relatives. And so he's in the store, actually, when the levees break. That he'd also, though, had the foresight to say, well, there might be a little bit of flooding, maybe. And he owned the boat, and so he brought his boat to the store, thinking that maybe there would be some minor flooding that occurred, and so it would be nice to have his boat with him. Turns out you get massive flooding. So he weathers the storm at discount zone, and then he says he reports sort of hearing screams after the hurricane had passed, after the flooding had occurred. He reports hearing screams from his neighborhood, people screaming, sort of faint screams coming from the neighborhood. So he, at a time, was still quite dangerous, and he starts going out on the boat and bringing people to his second story of his store. So he rescues up to 30 people in the immediate aftermath of Katrina passing and the flooding occurring. So he's a hero in a sort of classic sense of the term. He truly saved lives on the day of Katrina. But he's a hero in another sense, too, for our story. Again, disasters destroy things, and people need those things to be replaced. After disaster, too, you need just the regular basic things that you need to go about and carry on your daily lives. You need food. You need a place to wash your clothes, particularly when homes are completely damaged. You need places to buy some basic toiletries and other stuff. That Casey was one of the first gas stations to open up. He was by far one of the first convenience stores to open up in the post-Katrina circumstance. And so his opening up his store made life, normal life in some sense, was a sort of prerequisite for normal life returning to that neighborhood. So let me tell you the story of LaToya Cantrell. LaToya was then the president of the Baltimore Improvement Association. Baltimore is a community of about 2,400 homes that's in the sort of heart of New Orleans. It's an historically diverse neighborhood that, in terms of wealth and race and ethnicity, that it's been described as a microcosm of the larger New Orleans. The before Katrina households in Baltimore earned incomes as low as $10,000 for the head of the household to as high as $200,000. So you had very wealthy, for relatively wealthy families living really right next door to much poorer families. The Baltimore Improvement Association was created long before Katrina, in the 1930s, and was an organizational body basically to lobby for public services. And so LaToya had been the president for a year before Katrina, and under her watch, the Baltimore Improvement Association did things like had a neighborhood watch, or was sort of petitioning at the time for a park in the neighborhood. Although Baltimore didn't get the kind of massive flooding that you got in other parts of New Orleans, that it did get average flooding of about 8 feet in the neighborhood. And it was weeks, again, before people were let back into their homes. And to assess the damage. And by the time they were let back in, as one resident said, their houses were pretty much, many of the houses were pretty much destroyed. His homes had to be completely gutted. So Latoya, through her leadership and with the, using the apparatus of the BIA, did two really significant things following Katrina. One of the difficulties after Katrina was that people, again, were displaced, and it was hard to know where even people in your own family were. Certainly hard to know where people in your neighborhood was. That, again, people had been evacuated to multiple places, but the BIA, the Baltimore Improvement Association, had a list. They actually had a list of everybody who lived in the, who owned the house in the neighborhood, and they had phone numbers and contact, their cell phone numbers, contact information, and what have you as well. And they had a structure that could actually access and tap into that list. And so they used that list to take advantage of some of the resources that they had in the community. And pretty soon you started seeing signs going up like Baltimore lives. And you also had that sort of through, with the aid of that list, people being informed and kept up to date of things that were happening in the community. And they needed to be kept up to date. And one of the reasons they needed to be kept up to date was so that they could resist what they affectionately called the green dot. So let me tell you a little bit about the green dot. After Katrina, there was a commission set up called the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. That commission was charged with creating a development plan for the community. That development plan, the planners that were charged with that plan decided that one of the things that they would like to see occur as a result of this effort was that maybe they could reduce the urban footprint of the city. That the city, they thought, needed sort of a lot more green space than it had, and that there seemed to be these neighborhoods that just wouldn't bounce back at all, and so they decided to sort of suggest that certain neighborhoods would be green space. And so they released the map, and it had green dots over where communities were, and the residents were told, look, before we'll even allow you to rebuild at all, that you're going to have to prove the viability. If you're in one of these green, these neighborhoods that were designated for the green dot, you're going to have to prove the viability of your community. And you're going to have to do that by getting 50% of the residents to commit to rebuilding. The Baltimore Improvement Association, with under Latoya's leadership, went beyond that. Not only did they get 50%, more than 50% to commit, they actually, because of the connections that they had in the neighborhood, they actually developed their own redevelopment plan. And that redevelopment plan was so successful that it ended up being incorporated into future redevelopment plans. Now, let me quickly tell you the story of Father Bien. It's the last story I'll tell today. Father Bien was the pastor of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church in New Orleans East. Before Katrina, the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church had roughly 3,800 Vietnamese American parishioners. Many lived within a mile of the church. This was a tight-knit and insular community at the time that Katrina hit. It was formed by people who sort of began their journey to the U.S. as from 3 small fishing villages in North Vietnam, and they, during the Vietnam War, had been evacuated to South Vietnam, and then had been sort of brought over with the aid of Catholic charities to New Orleans East. And in New Orleans East, they sort of built a second homeland, in essence. And the church was the center in both a literal and emotional sense of that community. And so the church had Vietnamese American, Vietnamese language masses, but it was also more than a church, right? It hosted cultural events, and it had a farmer's market on the weekend, and it was a social place where community members can meet. The older people in the community would talk about going to the church every every day. The New Orleans East also had some of the worst flooding in New Orleans. Had flood levels again at the highest level, 12 feet. But despite the severe damage, this community was one of the first to rebound. It was one of the first to bounce back. And it bounced back because of Father Bien and his leadership. So I talked about Casey Kassim being a leader, being a hero in the true sense of the term after Katrina. So was Father Bien, it turned out. Father Bien had decided to wait out the storm in the schoolroom on the church grounds, second floor of school in the church grounds, with several hundred of his parishioners who just were either too old or didn't want to evacuate. The way that Katrina had sort of passed over, and then there was a sort of break, and people started to go home, and then the flooding began to occur. And so Father Vian, again, goes out, starts, on a boat that he had, starts rescuing people from their homes as the floodwaters are rapidly rising. Christians like to do so. So he saved lives. But he did two other things that were critical to getting this community back. One thing he did was immediately, he and the church leadership under his direction started visiting the evacuation sites. And so they have visited evacuation sites in Louisiana, Texas, and Georgia, and Arkansas. And at every site, they did basically the same thing. One thing they did was they took pictures of the parishioners who've been displaced to those sites. They did that so that if they could sort of assure people that they were going to see elsewhere that their family members or their friends were okay. So they took pictures. They also, though, very quickly started focusing on the term. And so they would tell, Father Vian would, tell people, look, tell people, having visited, the site in Baton Rouge, tell the people at the site in Atlanta, talk to the people in Baton Rouge, they're fully committed to returning and rebuilding. That they're there's no doubt in my mind that they're all going to come back. And you tell the people in Houston the same thing about the people in Atlanta. You tell the people in Atlanta the same thing about the people in Houston as he sort of made the rounds. And so very quickly, everybody started to believe the sort of notion that this community is going to bounce back, and sort of quickly focused attention on bouncing back. But the other thing he did was he prioritized rebuilding the church. He recognized that the church was the center of the community, and that if you built the church first, that people would have this sort of impetus to return. And so he started hosting mass in the church within 6 weeks of Katrina. This is at a time when New Orleans is a ghost town. There's nobody in New Orleans at the time. This is a real ghost town. And he's hosting mass. His first mass that he hosts on August 9th gets 300 attendees. By the end of the month, he's getting 2,000 of the 3,800 parishioners that are coming back from wherever they've evacuated to this mass. And he's doing other things too. He's taking pictures of the parishioners as they come back from the mass, and he's using those pictures of the parishioners to essentially guilt the power company and the utility companies into sort of turning on the services and the garbage collectors and the city to resume garbage collection in the neighborhood and the like, and also using those pictures of those parishioners to guilt the relief agencies to donate sort of needed stuff as well. And so the argument that when we lay out in the book, the argument that I quickly went through here is that after a disaster, entrepreneurs can perform a key role. And so one of the implications for policy of that sort of argument is that you should give entrepreneurs the space to act. That given that they perform these key functions after the disaster, you should give them the space to act. The two ways that you can do this that I want to highlight here. One is you can avoid top-down planning. At the time that a disaster occurs, there's this sort of temptation to sort of redo the city anew. There's this sort of temptation to have a top-down plan that sort of does things like reduces the city's overall footprint. After Hurricane Katrina, it turns out in the 5 years following it, we had something like 5 comprehensive development plans of certain levels, some of which had more or less community impact during that period of time. That one danger of these plans, and I mentioned the green dot, is that they create a ton of uncertainty. That all of a sudden it's unclear to residents if they would even be allowed to build, if they're going to be allowed to go back to their homes, and sort of what the sort of building codes and what have you would look like for the homes that would go. That has one effect that has is it sort of keeps entrepreneurs on the sidelines. It keeps residents rebuilding. Another thing that policymakers might do to ensure that entrepreneurs have the space to act, though, is to eliminate, suspend, or simplify rules that hamper entrepreneurship. There's some rules that make sense, that may make sense in mundane times, that just simply don't make sense after the disaster. My favorite example of this are the rules, say, around daycare centers. And sort of the extent to which daycare centers need to be licensed, and they need to have certain license. People in the daycare, and they need to be in a building of a certain, sort and size, and what have you. And the ratio of daycare workers to students needs to be a certain ratio. In Monday times, you can sort of imagine all kinds of reasons why that kind of rule makes sense, right? That you want to, maybe ensure that that every daycare center is providing some minimal level of care, sort of across the board. So you sort of have these rules in place. But after a disaster, the rule may not make sense. After a disaster, you got, again, after a disaster like Katrina, you got half the city's no longer there. And you got the demand for daycare centers potentially going up. And so anybody who used to keep a child in a home, or used to keep a child with a relative, there's a good chance that that home is now been destroyed or been damaged severely. They're sort of eradicating more. It's now a construction site, so there's a need to put more kids in daycare. It's a good chance that the daycare facility has been damaged or destroyed as well. And so that the optimal place to watch kids might not be there. It's certainly a good chance that the number and incidence of licensed daycare workers has been reduced at a time, again, where the demand for those daycare workers, the demand for those daycare workers are going up. And so that has the effect of sort of reducing the availability of daycare. And so a rule that in mundane times was doing something like guaranteeing a minimal amount of care, so that was guaranteed across all daycare centers, becomes a rule that sort of reduces the number of daycare centers that are now open and available to help people after the disaster, at a time when the demand is going up. And so if you're somebody with a child who's contemplating, you're somebody with a child and you now have been displaced to Houston or Atlanta, and you're wanting to come back, well, you can't come back, because now the availability of daycare centers isn't there. So you have that kind of challenge. There are other rules that are sort of have that kind of effect. And so after the disaster, entrepreneurs, we argue in the book, do three really important things. They provide needed goods and services, they work to restore disrupted social networks, and they signal that community revival is likely to occur, and in fact already underway. And thank you for listening.